Hello and welcome to screencast number 8 on chapter 18, Global Climate Change. So now we're going to take a look about climate change and how it affects our society, and we're going to start with agriculture. And there's a good and a bad with this. In the temperate zones, where they will receive moderate warming, this might slightly increase production because the growing seasons are going to be longer, so we're going to see a boost in crop yields. Additional carbon dioxide to the plants for photosynthesis may also increase the yields. That's the bright side of things. But the IPCC predicts that global crop yield, even though it might increase, when it reaches 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit as a temperature increase, it is expected the crop yields will decline. We'll see that seasonally dry tropical and subtropical regions will have growing seasons that will be shortened. And if it's shortened, harvest may be susceptible to being lower and drought. Scientists also predict that crop production will fall in regions even with minor warming, and that will worsen hunger in the world's most developing nations. We have to take a look at forestry, and this is where our timber and paper products come from, and it enriches the atmospheric carbon dioxide, which may spur greater growth in the near term, but the other climate effects such as drought and fire and disease may eliminate the gains. Just looking at what happened with El Nino in 1997 and 1998, we had droughts that allowed immense forest fires to destroy a lot of areas of rainforest in Indonesia, Brazil, and Mexico. And in North America, the forest managers were seeing increasingly catastrophic fires, invasive species like kudzu and some caterpillars that will eat the leaf off of a lot of trees. There was insect and disease outbreaks. The catastrophic fires that caused that were caused from decades of fire suppression increased the intensity of those fires. It promoted longer, warmer, and drier fire seasons, and milder winters and hotter and drier summers are promoting outbreaks of bark beetles that are destroying millions of acres of trees, all having an impact on us and our ecosystem services. Let's consider the health effects from heat waves and the stress that can cause death. How many times have we heard of a child left in a car that temperatures can get really high in? That's one factor. Respiratory ailments from air pollution is another factor. We're getting tropical diseases that are expanding, like dengue fever, that are coming into the temperate regions that our systems are not used to. So there's a lot of vectors of infectious disease. Our mosquitoes, which are bringing West Nile virus and other diseases along to us towards the poles that we haven't been exposed to before. Disease and sanitation problems happen when floods overcome our sewage treatment systems. And we saw how those sewage treatment systems are right next to waterways, which can deliver that disease and sanitation problems. Injuries from drowning, from the storms, from houses collapsing, and that health hazards from cold weather will actually decrease, but most researchers feel that the increase in warm weather hazards will more than offset any gains from the cold weather. And this is drought destroying a corn crop. So, economics. And we always go to economics. The cost will outweigh the benefits of climate change. It's going to cost us so much to maintain. It'll widen the gap between the rich and the poor. There will be less wealth, and technology will suffer the most. The external cost of damages we're predicting will be about $10 per 350 tons of carbon. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're talking about trillions and gazillions of carbon being put out, it's going to increase the cost of 1 to 5% of the GDP on the average globally. On average globally, sorry about that. Poor nations will lose more than the rich ones will. So there was a high profile economic study done called the Stern Review that was commissioned by the British government, and they concluded that climate change could cost us roughly 5 to 20% of the gross domestic product by the year 2200. And they said, but investing just 1% of the GDP starting now could enable us to avoid future costs. So what they're saying is if we spend money now to mitigate climate change, it will save us a great deal more money in the future. That's the prediction. So where we live will determine how we experience the impacts of climate change, so it depends on the region. Temperature changes have been the greatest in the Arctic. That's where we're seeing the melting ice sheets, the thinning of ice, and the increasing storms. It's harder for people and polar bears to hunt. I know you've heard about polar bears, and a lot of people think it's a joke, but they depend on those ice sheets. And the thinning ice sheets they fall through, and even though they can swim long distances, the animals and the organisms they depend on are also going to be affected by the thinning of these ice sheets. The permafrost is melting, as we discussed, excuse me, and destabilizing buildings and trees. People that rely on cutting down trees in that particular area, they can't even drive their trucks on the roads because of the permafrost melting. So it creates quite a few problems. As far as the impacts of the United States, we have analyzed those, and we have the National Climate Assessment, which was finalized in 2014. This National Climate Assessment was produced by 240 scientists that were overseen by about a 60-person staff, and the draft is online for public comment, so please make sure you look at that. The report makes it clear that some impacts are being felt across the nation, as we see average temperatures across the United States have already increased by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since record keeping began in 1895. Over 80% of this rising occurring since 1980. The temperatures are predicted to rise another 4 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. Extreme weather events have become more frequent and costly, and they will continue to worsen, imposing escalating costs on farmers, city dwellers, and coastal communities and taxpayers across the country. So we can look at all the changes that's happening. Here's the ice sheets melting. This Inuit, it's changing how far he can go and hunt for food and fish, and there's danger to his life if he happens to step on thinning ice. Here's what permafrost is causing as far as buildings that are collapsing that we can see. We mentioned this National Climate Assessment, and we're going to see that the impacts, as I already stated, are going to vary by region. The United States will get drier and the northern will get wetter. Some regions will experiencing flooding, and sea levels are going to rise more on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and we're going to see an increase in greenhouse gases. So taking a look at Table 8.3, here's some predicted impacts of climate change for the United States. We already said that there should be an increase of temperature from 4 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to produce droughts and flooding and wildfires, which will get worse. We'll have more extreme weather events. Sea levels are going to rise anywhere from 1 to 4 feet by the year 2100. We'll see storm surges continue. Health problems will be a big factor. Drought, fire, and pest outbreaks are going to continue. We're going to see our marine ecosystems and fisheries affected by the ocean acidification. And even though we're getting more CO2, which will favor longer growing seasons, there's going to be an increased drought and heat stress and more pest and disease that will decrease the crop yields. The snowpack will decrease in the west and water shortages will worsen in those areas. The alpine ecosystems and barrier islands will begin to vanish, and the northeast forest will lose their sugar maples. Southwest ecosystems will turn more desert-like, and the melting permafrost will undermine Alaskan buildings and roads. You can take a look at the reduced emissions scenario and the continued emissions scenario. If we look at the top one, even if we sharply reduce the emissions, there's still going to be temperature change that will happen. Temperatures are predicted to rise by 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and if we continue with our scenario, as we see right here, temperatures are predicted to rise by 7 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you know, in these dark areas, look at the areas affected by this. 8 degrees temperature change for the area that we're living in. All right, so these are the predictions. And even in this graphic, the impacts of climate change will vary by region. So here's a few. And some of the most important. We're going to see sea level rise in the northeast, heavy precipitation events, summer heat waves will degrade the air quality, and we'll have our forest composition changing. This is the area that we live in. In the southeast, we're going to see sea levels rising, hurricanes and storms that will impose this area, heat stress and health risks. Alaska, we're going to see the melting of permafrost, the loss of sea ice, the Hawaiian Islands, acidification, sea level will rise, heat and disease as well. The Southwest is going to find drought intensifying, the Northwest more wildfires. So these are just some of the major ones that are predicted, and there's much more. When we take a look at this particular graphic, this one represents human-induced global climate change, that it stems from several causes, and these are the causes on the left: the warming of the atmosphere, the fuel use, fossil fuel use, human population growth, growth per capita, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and results in a diversity of consequences, and these are our consequences that we're seeing in the boxes: economic loss, health impacts, droughts and flooding and crop failures, glacier and ice cap melting, sea level rise, a shift of organisms. Okay, so all of these are the different diversity consequences that will happen, and this is going to happen for ecological systems as well as human beings. The arrows in this concept map lead from the causes to the consequences, and the items are grouped within the boxes do not necessarily share any special relationship. The outlined boxes are intended merely for the streamline of the figure that we're seeing. It's pretty scary. Okay, so we're going to end here, end screencast 8, and we will continue at this point with screencast 9.